joining us in today's conversation brought to you by Gatopardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Mia Armstrong, and I'm a journalist and Cronkite graduate. These days, I'm based in Mexico City, where I coordinate journalism projects that ASU has in collaboration with Mexican partners. I'll be guiding us through today's chat, which is part of a series of 8 public conversations that together form Simbiosis, the space to co-learn and co-create narrative journalism. Simbiosis is an innovative collaboration between Cronkite and Gatopardo, born from a desire to strengthen narrative journalism in the Americas. Our goal is to empower young journalists with the tools they need to shed light on the most pervasive problems in our region, such as systemic inequality, social injustice, and the climate crisis. In addition to these 8 public conversations held weekly on Wednesday evenings from October 6th through November 24th, Simbiosis includes a hands-on workshop on narrative journalism techniques to be held virtually in spring 2022, and a project-based on-site residency program for select journalists, which will be held at Gatopardo facilities in the Yucatan Peninsula in summer of next year. Simbiosis is meant to represent not only the interconnectedness of our 2 organizations throughout this program, but also the reality of our region. We believe in collaborative, multilingual, multicultural, solutions-facing journalism, and we're committed to increasing the accessibility to the training that facilitates this type of journalism. We hope that you'll join us throughout this collaboration and that together we can question, explore, and reconstruct what we know about tradecraft periodístico. As an introduction to the series, today we want to take a step back and ask some fundamental questions about narrative journalism. What makes a story a narrative? What value does narrative journalism bring that non-narrative reporting cannot? What are the biggest ethical and logistical challenges and the biggest beauty in the practice of narrative journalism, particularly when it comes to representing people and their reality? To guide us through these questions, we're incredibly lucky to be joined by Fernanda Santos, a Southwest Borderlands Initiative Professor of Practice at the Cronkite School, where she teaches narrative journalism and bilingual reporting. Fernanda is currently based in Phoenix, but she got her start in journalism in Brazil, her home country, where she says she bore witness to violence, inequality, and immeasurable hope, which together spurred her passion for telling true stories. Fernanda's journalistic range is impressive. Not only does she write in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, but she's also covered a huge variety of topics, from the crisis of houselessness among elderly Americans to the legacy of Sheriff Joe Arpaio on Arizona politics, and even the factors shaping violent crime in Colombia. Fernanda worked for 12 years at the New York Times, where she served as the paper's Phoenix bureau chief. Fernanda's first book, The Fire Line, The Story of the Granite Mountain Hotshots, tells the story of the devastating 2013 Yarnell Hill fire and one crew of 20 firefighters that fought it. Only one survived. The book investigates in precise detail the factors that led to the hotshots' death, but it's really a story about their lives. And reading it is a masterclass in reconstructing events using documents, official reports, and interviews, and painting an accurate, complex, compassionate picture of your subjects. Many of the most important journalism skills I've learned, I was lucky enough to learn from Fernanda, who was my professor while I was studying at Cronkite. And to this day, Fernanda, you'll be proud to know that when I begin a story, I write at the top of the page the sentence, "My story is about," which is a trick I learned from Fernanda to focus narrative and to keep in mind one's purpose while writing and reporting. I also, as a student, bore witness to the unmistakable combination of expertise and empathy that Fernanda brings to each interview, which is clearly reflected in her writing. Fernanda is currently a contributing columnist at the Washington Post Opinions Desk, and she is deep in work on her memoir. Fernanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's such a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mia, for this great introduction.
No, thank you. And to get us started, I want to start with a question that is a little bit more definitional and stage setting. And that is, what does a story need to become a narrative? And how is narrative reporting different from other reporting?
So I want to start by bringing you back probably to a period in your life that you don't remember. But let's say think about your latest, most recent interaction with a child who can't yet speak, or who's just learning how to speak, right? That child is excited. Let's imagine that the child just left her or his first day of daycare and is coming home and very stimulated, Many things happen in that child's day, and the child is sharing with you, blabbing, using hands, using facial expressions. And we can tell that that child is telling us a story. And that in the child's mind, that story has a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And more than anything, a very clear focus, a very clear purpose. Why is it that the child is telling us that story? And how the story came together in the child's mind was informed by the experiences the child lived through that morning, that day in daycare, and selected, and the details that the child is sharing. We may not necessarily understand them, but in the child's mind, everything is selected based on those inflection points on the day. You know, things happen throughout our day, but our day is more like they're usually more like an EKG, right? They go up and down, up and down. Some things are okay and we just kind of let them go and they're kind of commonplace. Other things are interesting or scary or exciting. So I tell this story, I start this conversation by talking about how a little child who cannot yet speak is already capable of telling stories, because I truly believe that we're all born storytellers. We know how to engage audiences. We know how to read audiences. We know when someone is losing interest, when they start looking at their phone or they're twirling their hair. They're looking for a way out because the story you're telling is no longer something they are engaged with. We can also tell when someone is interested, right? So that goes back to your question. What is different in between a narrative story and a non-narrative story? Nothing is different other than the way we tell them. The reporting that you engage in to gather the facts for one and the other is you use the same reporting skills for both. But you go about your reporting for a narrative story much like you would go about exploring your day and selecting those interesting, special, remarkable moments to recount your day to your partner when you go home, to a friend when you go out for dinner, to your mom when you speak with her on the phone. So the skill set is the same. It's the way that everything is packaged and how you have more freedom to explore the details and the depth of the remarkable things that happen throughout your day or throughout your story, that create all that provide you with all the different um, skills, or not skills, not the right word, provide with all the different tools that you need to build a great narrative story.
I love this idea that storytelling is fundamental to narrative journalism, and storytelling is also fundamental to who we are as humans, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if we could dig into that a little bit more, because it seems like there's certainly a need for non-narrative reporting, right? We need the reporters who can go in and who can, be on the floor of Congress and then tell us about the bill that just passed that day. But then we also need this narrative storytelling where we're getting into the lives of the people who are going to be affected by that bill, or the person who pushed forward that bill. And so could you talk a little bit about why we need narrative journalism and kind of what impact that gives us that traditional reporting might not?
Well, that's a great question. Well, there are, I guess, three basic needs. One of them is in the way that news is produced and consumed now on a 24-hour basis, right? There's this immediacy to providing the latest development on a story to our audiences. Um, doing a non choosing the non-narrative approach is less complicated, is easier, go straight to the point. Your audience on their phones, on their computers, on the radio, are able to get what's going on quickly and move on. Okay, I understand Biden is now meeting with the president of France, or Biden has met with the president of France during the UN meeting here in New York in the United States, after a spat over missiles to Australia, right? So we know that happened during that meeting. When it happened, I remember getting an alert on my phone. I read the first couple of paragraphs and I felt like, okay, I know what happened. I'm informed. I'll go on with my day. Now, why it matters to me or to you. Why should it matter to everybody else? That's most often something that is best accomplished through a narrative story. A narrative story, when well done, should offer the audiences many different ways to connect with what's going on. So sometimes it's because we find some similarities between what we're experiencing and what the character or characters in that narrative story are experiencing. Sometimes it's because the way we open the story in a scene, something is happening. A mother is now in line for the first time to get food at a food bank because she's lost her job during the pandemic. She is now home taking care of her children, and she's run through her savings to keep paying her rent while she was unemployed, and she's at her, uh, she's she's in great need for help. Um, when we're there in line with that mother, when we see what the mother is seeing around her, when we might even go inside the mother's head and get a glimpse of the thoughts that she is having at that moment. Um, when we observe the reaction of the children that she had to bring with her because she had nobody to leave the children with, then we are immersed into that world with the character, with this mother, and we begin to feel for her and feel with her. We don't necessarily need to go to a food bank to get for the day. So the main role of narrative storytelling for me is to make people care about very important things that are going on in the world around us, in our communities, in other countries, wherever that might be, on the border of between the US and Mexico. When we tell stories narratively through scenes, through actions that a character is engaged in, through interactions that the character is having with other people, the immersion of the audience in that story happens um, as a result of that. It's much easier to believe in the purpose of a story and to buy into that story and keep on listening to it, watching it on TV or wherever you watch your news these days, reading it, especially if you find a way to connect. And that's the beauty of narrative, is to offer that point of connection. So I think there were two reasons. Maybe there's a third one and I'll think about it later.
No, I mean, I think that's really beautiful, is this idea that narrative journalism is a means of connection that almost allows us to more fully experience what it is to be human, right? The emotions that are involved in this complex process of being human. And you mentioned at the same time this fact that we live in a culture where there's a demand for the immediate, where we're dominated many times by a news notification, by a message, by the need for quickness and immediacy. And so do you worry that there is going to be a harder future for narrative journalism? Do you worry about decreasing demand for this type of journalism, as important as it is?
No, I actually think the opposite. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of the third reason why narrative is important, and it relates directly to the question you were asking. And the reason it's important is that it provides a different way to read the same story, a different way to learn about the same event. Think about the non narrative style, right? The hard news style. You and I and many other journalists can go to a scene, and something's happening, right? A story is something happening for a reason. So we're there because a building is on fire and there are people trapped inside. And we're watching the firefighters struggle to get the fire out and to go inside and rescue these people. Um, if we were to do a non-narrative a news of this event, most likely your lead, my lead, and John's lead next to me would be the same or very, very similar, because we would base that lead on answering what's known in journalism as the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. And so once that notification is pushed on somebody's phone, once somebody goes on a website and reads that hard news story about this fire that's happening, and reads through the first and second paragraph, there's really not much else that's necessary for you to learn. And there's really no incentive to go from, let's say, my breaking news story to Mia's breaking news story to John's breaking news story or Maria's breaking news story. It's all going to be pretty much the same. Now, if you and I are at the scene, and let's say I choose to do a hard news approach, non-narrative, just the facts, and let me put this out there, but you're there and you see that there is a firefighter going inside that building, and you decide, and there's a woman on a window asking for help, and you decide to focus your story about this fire on the drama that's unfolding as the fire is burning. Now you're no longer talking about a fire. You're talking about two people, one whose life is threatened by the fire. I mean, both of them their lives are threatened by the fire, but one whose role is to go into the fire to rescue someone, and the other who is hoping that someone will go in there and get her out, right? So we just created a very different way to talk about the same thing that many other journalists may have written about in the non-narrative format or the hard news format. So when we look at the evolution or the future of journalism, or even the present of journalism, there is more and more need, and I think there is and will be more and more interest in approaching stories from a narrative perspective. Because one, you make people care, as I've said, but two, you also make it seem like they're watching a movie almost, or reading a fiction book. There are all these different elements that create the suspense, that make you care about somebody, not care about somebody else, really hate that Border Patrol agent, really root for that Haitian man who's carrying his child on his shoulders to get across the border. All of these things are factual, but the moment that we lend a narrative tone to that story, that we give a narrative approach to that story, they become exciting, interesting. We want to know how it ends. We want to get to the end so quickly. And so we continue to consume that story. So if we really believe, as I do, that the future of journalism is in our ability to create deeper and more meaningful connections between the news and the news consumers, then I see a great future for narrative, because that's the most obvious way to create that connection.
And so you mentioned, I'm really interested in this idea that you mentioned, that journalism is about constructing a reality or reconstructing a reality, and there are different angles with which to look at that reality, right? And different storytelling kind of gives us a different types of storytelling gives us a different angle. It seems like narrative reporting, from what you're saying, is kind of bringing into people into that reality, right? Bringing them into the scene, into the mind of the folks who are living that scene. And, at the same time, reconstructing reality is complicated, especially when you're dealing with people who themselves are complicated and messy. And so how do you think about the biggest challenges when you're trying to reconstruct reality, or a version of reality, or, getting as close to reality as you might be able to get? And especially when you're trying to reconstruct your characters, the people that you're representing.
Wow. I mean, in an ideal world, you would have public records, documents to back up things that the person is telling you, their perception of the facts, because there are the facts that we all observe, and then there are the ways that we each perceive the facts. It doesn't mean that your perception is better than mine. It's just different. And each perception is informed by who we are and what we have experienced in life. So my eyes may be drawn to the firefighter and the woman asking for help at the window because I have witnessed so many of these events when I lived in New York and I was a reporter there. And because I am drawn to stories that involve this drama and suspense around life, that, this is what is naturally going to draw my attention. Whereas your attention may have been drawn to the people watching all of this unfold, all the neighbors and friends and family members gather there because, maybe you experienced something like that in your life and you remember the reaction that you and your loved ones had as something traumatic was going on, right? So just to characterize this idea of reality is different than facts. I like to use facts and perception because the facts are the facts, is what happened, and then the perception is how we observed and absorbed those facts, right? So so when we think of it that way, then we have to rely on the stories that people tell us if we are reconstructing that reality, which often happens. You sit down with the firefighter after the fact and ask them to describe the fire inside, and you sit down with a lady who was at the window waiting for somebody to rescue her, and she will relay that same fire in a different way, the sensation of fire, what she was seeing, of the way the flames were shaped around her, right? So, like I said, in an ideal world, you would have public documents, 911 calls, recordings that you could listen to and back up some of those things, or fill in some of the gaps, or correct some of the incorrect things that people told you, because again, they perceive them differently. They may remember them differently, or may simply misremember. But the world is very imperfect, and we often have to rely on the stories that on the version of reality that people tell us. And that's when I think it's really important for us to make clear to the audience that that story that they are experiencing with you is told through and experienced through the eyes of a certain character or a group of characters, or maybe two characters, so that they understand that this is how these people perceived what was going on. And because it's a new story, you will have in this narrative story a something that anchors that story on the facts. So to use the example of the fire, we know when the fire broke out, when 911 was called, how many firefighters were brought to the scene, how long it took to put it out, how many fires have burned on that block recently. Is this a place where many fires burn? The material the building was made of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If it is a profile that you're building of someone, you will obviously talk to the person, hopefully talk to the person you're profiling, although it sometimes happens that the person doesn't want to talk to you. But you will also talk to many other people who know that person, so that you will get other people's perspectives on that person's own perspective of themselves. I hope that's making sense. So the idea is to build these safety measures so that you don't get misled by the people you're talking to, and create a version of reality that is not attached to truth, to facts. And at the same time, that you're honest and allow and inform your reader, not to say, dear reader, this story is told through the eyes of, Mia, Fernanda, and John and Maria, but in telling this story, that it's clear to the reader that we are going on a journey as if we were a camera mounted, a GoPro mounted on somebody's helmet, like a movie screen where the point of view is from that character. Not a movie screen, but a movie you're watching where the point of view is from a specific character. And in that way, it's understood that the facts are there, but the way the facts were perceived by the character or characters that you chose to lead your story, to be your guide in that story, may be slightly different than what, let's say, the official version of events.
I think that's a really good roadmap for dealing with some of those challenges. And it raises the question also for me, in your experience, what is the most valuable or rewarding part of having to get or being able to get really close to people and trying to represent them in all of their complexity?
I think the first the first and most important element of it is the opportunity to learn something new. Um, there's I think when I started out as a journalist, when I was in my early 20s, I thought I had all the power as a journalist. The reality is that it's a scale. And when we start our relationship with our characters, when we start reporting our story, whether it be the sources, the experts we talk to, the officials we're interviewing, the common folk that whose stories we're telling, they have more power than we do because they have the power to say no. They have the power to select what they want to tell you or not tell you. They have the power to embellish things, even, or to change things because they don't want you to know exactly what happened or how things happen. Um, so, as you report and you build these safeguards, you talk to other people, you look into whatever public records are available to back up the stories you're hearing. You read other coverage. If it's a big news story, other reporters will be writing about that or doing TV stories about it or radio pieces about it, podcasts. So you get informed by what others are writing and you create your own list of questions to confirm, reconfirm, double check, triple check with the people who you're talking to. And as you acquire that knowledge that goes beyond the knowledge that's being provided to you by each individual, now you have the collective knowledge. Then the scale starts to shift, right? Here's this, your sources are, and the people you're talking to were higher, you're lower, but now your knowledge is making things change. And all of a sudden you start getting more power. But the moment that the great power that a journalist has is the power to write, or I say write because I'm a writer, but to create stories based on the stories they hear from others. But that is actually not so much a power to me, it's a great responsibility. So, in addition to learning so much from the people I talk to, even if it's a subject that I'm already very familiar with or that I might consider myself an expert in, I also constantly remind myself of the great responsibility that I carry in being the vessel through which stories will be amplified and told to a much greater audience. All of a sudden, the plight of a mother on standing in line to get food from a food bank that was a very private experience will be made public by the story I will tell, right? So I think the learning is great. The responsibility, I don't take it as a burden. I don't see it as something heavy and difficult to deal with. It does cause that anxiety. Like, I think we've all experienced that. We go to bed at night and let's say the story is coming out, it's going to be posted online at 5 a.m. the next day, or it's going to be in the next issue of the magazine that's going to be in hit newsstands or the web, the next morning. And we go to bed and sometimes we can't even sleep. We're so anxious, so scared. We start thinking, oh my gosh, I made so many mistakes. I must have gotten something wrong. I should have written that sentence differently. It's too late now. So there is that fear that we have. But I think it's the fear that keeps us on our toes. I choose to embrace that fear, that responsibility as my own system of checks and balances. It's okay to call somebody and go over the story again because I want to make sure that the story is correct. It's okay to print out a story and read it for the 10th time. It's okay to call my editor and go over the portions of the story that are very challenging to me because I'm not exactly sure that I am properly representing what I really want to represent based on the choices I made from the interviews that I had and the observations that I had and the experiences that I shared with my characters. So it's a little bit of a long answer, but I think it's so important for us to for journalists to look at the responsibility we carry not as a burden, but as a way to keep us, to keep us in check and to fuel us to do the best job that we possibly can, to be the best possible version of ourselves as journalists and as humans as we possibly can as we tell these stories.
I really appreciate your framing of that responsibility. And it's a question that I've thought about a lot, especially these power dynamics where maybe as a reporter, you're going into a community that hasn't had a lot of experience with being covered by traditional news outlets. You know, maybe they're not exactly aware of what participating in an interview would look like, or what consequences it might bring for them, what benefits it might bring for them. I think there's these inherent power dynamics in a lot of these situations. And I've been thinking a lot about what informed consent to an interview looks like, right? If I'm going to get really close to the most intimate details of someone's life, and then I'm going to project those intimate details into the world, how do I have the conversation with them about, you know, why they should talk to me, but also what might be the consequences for them of talking to me, and really leaving the decision in their hands. So I wonder kind of how you think about this idea of informed consent and just making sure that your subjects have the most autonomy possible in the process.
That's such an important question. I think honesty is, the simple answer is honesty. You have to be honest. You have to be honest with the people you're talking to. This is what my story is about. You don't have to disclose to them every little detail of the story, but you have to tell them what the story is about. This is why I want to talk to you, and why I believe it's important to talk to you for this story. And this is where it's going to come out. And are you familiar with it? Do you understand what it means to speak, say, to the Washington Post or the New York Times or Gatopardo, or, you know, the local newspaper in Hermosillo? You have to explain to people, exactly because of what you said. Most people are not, they know about journalism and journalists from the telenovelas they watch, or, you know, the movies they see. And most of them do a really poor job at depicting the work of journalists. So their view of what we do and how it's done is skewed by Hollywood, or by fiction, by the very strong element of fiction that comes with it. So you have to explain to them and be honest. And if it's something that you're going to follow someone over a period of time, I like to remind that person here and there, not as a way of discouraging the person from talking to me, because also you have to understand that you're after a story, right? And that person, that person should be capable of, and if not, you have to speak with someone who is capable of making a decision to speak to the reporter or not. It doesn't mean that it always ends well. And I'll give you a quick example. Years ago, I was a reporter at the New York Times based in New York, and I went to cover the release from prison of a young man who had served 16 years for a rape and murder he did not commit. He was exonerated through DNA. He was innocent. And during the news conference, he seemed very interesting. He seemed like someone that I should spend more time with. And I became very curious about writing about what it's like to experience a first year of freedom when you leave prison, after serving a long time for something you never did, for a crime you didn't commit. And that man happened to be about the same age that I was. So I thought of myself between the ages of 17 and 33, which were the years he was in prison, so much that I did, right? So there was a lot to explore, a lot to talk about, a lot to accompany him on. And I spent a good portion of 9 months of my life with that man, following him. At least once a week, I would be with him. I would talk to him on the phone almost every day. I was there for many, many moments of his life. And there was one question that I was very curious about. He was arrested at 16, convicted at 17. So I thought, was he a virgin when he went to prison? And did anything happen in prison to him? You know? So I kept waiting for the right moment to ask that question. And so I framed the question, have you ever made love? Because that's different than have you ever had sex? Because I also wanted to avoid the idea of prison sex as, to equate prison sex with, the sex that we experience in the outside world. And he told me that no, that he was a virgin, that he'd never had sex with a woman. That's what he told me. I've never had sex with a woman. And so I put that in the story, all the things he missed. So there was a sequence of things, and I included, and he said he's never made love. I even put that he said, to with a little bit of a skepticism, just in case something happened and he didn't want to share. And I made sure to tell him, look, when you tell me things like that, it's possible that they will be in my story. And he said, it's okay, Fernanda. I trust you. It's okay. And when the story came out and he saw it, he was livid. He was so mad at me. He screamed. He called me. He screamed. His mother called me and screamed at me. It was just a horrible experience. And in the end, after months, he didn't talk to me, didn't want anything to do with me. I found out that he was just embarrassed. He was just very embarrassed as a man in his mid-30s who all of a sudden the world knows that he's never had sex with a woman. And so we worked through it. But even, as I said, when you take all sorts of precautions, when you're respectful and you're clear with people, when they see their life told through your eyes, it many times it surprises them. And in this case, in the case of this man, it made him incredibly sad, because I think he was able to see for the first time how really terrible it was what happened to him, and how out of place he was in the world outside. Wasn't that quick of a story? Sorry.
No, I mean, I think it's a powerful story, an example of how the reporting really requires getting so close to these intimate details of people's lives. And so I wonder, we have this idea of like journalistic distance, right? Where you have to be able to step back, and at the end of the day, your job is to paint the picture, not that they want painted of themselves, but again, this closest version of reality based on facts that you can paint. And I was struck by this also when I was reading the fire line, particularly in your author's note. You write about, reading a diary and personal writings that the hotshots had. You write about spending an immense amount of time with their families, at times staying in their families' homes, listening to the music and that they listened to, and the books that they read. And so I wonder how you think about this concept of journalistic distance. How do you balance the need to get really close to the most intimate parts of people's lives, and then at the same time, the need to be able to step away and think about how to accurately represent those people and those facts and truths?
What I keep in mind as I'm reporting these stories is I am not writing for them. I am writing about them. Because when you start thinking that you're writing for the people you're reporting on, that's when you run the risk of not seeing things for what they are, or as you write, change the words a little bit to make them to make something less intense or less serious, or to overlook something because it might, let's say, embarrass that person. But if you keep in mind that you're writing about that person, and you come into your story with respect for that person, regardless, it can be the worst criminal in the world. The respect it doesn't mean, I agree with what you did, but the respect comes from you're allowing me into your life so that I can tell about the horrible things you did, and show more of you, more of the nuance in the story than has been shown before, right? So if you go approach the story with the idea, I'm writing about that person, about that dynamic, not for that person, and that I respect them, but I'm not, I don't owe them anything other than my gratitude for the time they are spending with me. Then I think that you're able to keep that distance, for lack of a better word, to remove yourself, because you do have to immerse yourself in their lives. But then you should be able to You have to be able to remove yourself, to then gather your thoughts, go through the material that you collected that day, those 2, 3 days, digest things, draw conclusions from them, make connections between what you saw or experienced with that person today and what you saw and experienced with that person last week or last month, in the case of a story that evolves over a period of time. And when I say, sit with your material at the end of a day or a few days, I think that that's really important. The longer you just report, and not engage with your material, the harder it becomes for you to maintain that analytical distance that's necessary for you to see, for you to be the one who selects the inflection points that would be part of the story and not let the person dictate those points for you. You understand? It's like it's an important distinction. It's one thing for me to have gone with this man who was wrongfully convicted that I was talking about to his hometown and drive by the police station where he was first interrogated and hear him tell me about that interrogation. We were in a car, and we got out of the car and we were walking, and I had my old-fashioned, not tape recorder, but digital recorder. I don't really trust iPhone recorders very much to this day. And I'm recording our conversation. But what I really thought was most interesting and would be most interesting to my reader was to look at his face and observe his reactions. Because there's one thing about wanting to sound tough after the fact. You're now 33 out of prison, and you were 16 years old when that interrogation happened, and you didn't have a lawyer, you didn't have anybody with you. And it's something else to look at the person's face and observe their body language as they're recounting that story with all the bravado that really wasn't present in that original interaction with the police. And through those reactions that you observe, be able to paint the picture of the fragility of that person. It's only if you, at the end of the day, sit down and you look through the notes that you made, that the person thought you're writing their words, but you're actually writing the way they, fidgeted and didn't look at the police station, kept looking ahead, looking at the floor, avoiding at every cost looking at that police station. It's only if you do that within a short period of experiencing that you can maintain the emotional impact that it has, and then translate that to your reader, because it's still very much alive in you. So I don't ever let my notes sit in my notebook or in my computer for a very long time without starting to work with them and draw lines and conclusions, sometimes even start writing paragraphs around them, because the what happened is still very vivid inside of me.
I have a million more questions for you about all these things, but I think there's one question that I can't hop off without asking you, and that's, you're not writing for your subjects, but who are you writing for when you set out to write a narrative story?
I don't necessarily pick an audience. The way that I approach this idea of who I'm writing for is more, I am writing for you, whoever it is that's reading this, to create, to stir something inside of you. Sometimes that feeling that's stirred inside the person is compassion, or is empathy. They relate to the story. They care about that person. Sometimes it's the complete opposite. It's anger. It's, gosh, they got what they deserved. Why are we wasting our time? Why did you waste your time, Ms. Journalist, writing about this if nobody cares? Well, you must care at least a little bit if you took the time to write a note to me, or post a comment online, or post something on Twitter about my story, right? It may not necessarily have been a positive type of caring, but it was caring nonetheless. It was an emotion. And so when I write to with the idea of providing my readers with enough emotional intensity and enough entry points into the story, different entry points into the story, or different ways to read that story, so that they can feel something as they read. Of course, ideally, I would say everybody totally agrees with everything I think about and write about and my angles in every story. But that's not how it happens in real life. But as long as you're reading and as long as you care and you're reacting to it one way or another, then I've done my job.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think it really brings us back to where we started, which is narrative storytelling as a way to make people connect and feel all of these emotions that are part of the human experience and our experience here together. And so thank you so much, Fernanda, for sharing your time and your expertise. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us in today's conversation. Remember that this is the first in a series of 8 public chats, which you can find exactly where you found this one for the next 7 Wednesdays until November 24th. These public conversations are part of Simbiosis, a narrative journalism training program brought to you by ASU's Cronkite School and Gatopardo. The program also includes a hands-on workshop held in the spring and on-site residencies in the Yucatan Peninsula held next summer. You can stay up to date on all the activities on our website or by subscribing to our mailing list, and you'll find both of those links below. Until next Wednesday, take care, cuídense.